Okay, so today we're going to look at the Mental Capacity Act. There is a slideshow along with this, so it would be really useful if you have the means to look at both the slideshow and follow the video at the same time. I have tried to do it by audio slide, which I've said that it is an audio PowerPoint, but I've tested it and I don't know why it's not working, so I'm going to have to do a video alongside it as well. So I'll just tell you which slide we're on so that you can look at it at the same time. So starting with slide 1, Mental Capacity Act 2005, just to say that the slides that I've used have come from my colleague Matt Graham, who has written widely around the Mental Capacity Act, and the book that putting the principles into the act into practice is his key text there. It's really useful, very accessible to read. So as Matt had done some fantastic slides, I've decided with his consent to use those. So today we'll be covering the definition of mental capacity, something about what a person who lacks capacity, what that means, the principles guiding the Act, thinking about the role of decision maker and the test of capacity. We'll also be looking at the term best interest, which is key to the Act, and there's also some other slides around advanced care planning and restriction and deprivation of liberty, which I won't be going into a lot of detail about, but I've kept them in because they're interesting, and if you're interested in looking further at those, you can do. But I'm going to tell you a point on the PowerPoint where, you know, if you've got a basic understanding, you've got the overview, you've definitely got what you need for the exam, then it's fine to stop at that point. With everything, you need to manage your own learning. If you want to stretch yourself a bit further, if this is something you feel comfortable with, then do that. But sometimes with law, the deeper you get, the more confused and overwhelmed you can get. So I do try and keep it at a level which is accessible and allows your learning to continue with confidence. So the second slide is the picture, the photo of the looks like a drunken night out with a man just about to fly onto his friends and land on them, and I think it's going to hurt. And it says, decisions, have you really thought them through? I think we have decisions every day of our life that we don't think through very well. I definitely do. But that's part of the fun of life as well. That's part of that risk and opportunities that we have. So this isn't something that's just for people who are in care, who have support. This is thinking about making decisions, and either the consequences of those decisions are not always as we've anticipated, sometimes better, sometimes worse. But, you know, that whole idea of whether we regret things in life is very much part of life's journey. So when we think about decisions in the Mental Capacity Act, we think about them, how many do we make in a day? You know, so even whatever time of day it is now that you are looking at this video, you've probably made loads of decisions already. It might have been some basic decisions around what to wear, what to eat for breakfast, whether to take the car or the train. You might have thought about the consequences, the cost of that. You might have made a decision to go out late last night and have to get up early this morning. That might have been quite an unwise decision, but nevertheless you still wanted to make it. You may also have made some huge decisions today. You might have made decisions, big financial commitments. You might have made decisions about a relationship, for example. So decisions affect us at every level, and the Mental Capacity Act really does cover all of those the range of decisions that we make. The Mental Capacity Act is very much around some of those specific decisions, but the principles behind the Mental Capacity Act really help us guide through that support that we offer to individuals, thinking about some of those principles that we're going to discuss. So, what is mental capacity? Mental capacity, we're on slide 3 now. I think it's 3. No, sorry, if that was 4. We're on 5 now. So, slide 5, it says, what is mental capacity? Mental capacity is the ability to make a decision. So that's what the law it's referred as. It includes ability to make decisions that affect our daily life or those bigger decisions in life. And so in terms of the next slide, slide 6, and lacking capacity, the law sees that a person who lacks capacity to make a particular decision or take a particular action for themselves at the time the decision or action needs to be taken. So it's very clear that when we are, if ever we're going to step in and make a decision for somebody, we have to be very clear on what that decision is, and it's at that particular time. And so then we move on to slide 7 to think about what was happening before the Mental Capacity Act. Well, people's autonomy to make decisions was not often respected. So people who were often written off as being incapable, maybe because of a diagnosis. So a lot of my experience in terms of learning disability was that people were deemed to not have capacity to make decisions. Often people might refer to them as, a mental age of 6, so they can't make any decisions. So the Mental Capacity Act was really quite transformational in saying that can no longer happen. We have to ensure that every decision that is made would go through this process. So in terms of the Mental Capacity Act, the first part of the Mental Capacity Act refers to the 5 statutory principles. And I talked about principles before when we've talked of other pieces of legislation, such as the Care Act, where we looked at that promotion of well-being. So in terms of the leading principle, the underpinning principle of the Mental Capacity Act, is that we should always presume capacity. And that's really, really important in terms of every situation that we go into. We must assume that that person, with some support potentially, will be able to make that decision. So if that's our belief, that should also be our aim. So it's quite it's sort of a nice mantra to kind of work alongside, really. Principle 2 is around support decision making. So we, instead of saying, we just need to find when we need to make a decision, our aim is actually to support, enhance that ability that the person will be able to make that decision. Thirdly, people can make unwise decisions, and that does not necessarily indicate they are lacking capacity. So as I said, I'm sure we've all made lots of unwise decisions. It doesn't mean that we didn't know that that decision was unwise at the time, but we still decided to take it, and we must enable people who perhaps need that support, that they're able to do the same. It's part of life. The principle number 4 is to respect the person's best interest. So there will be situations where an individual can't make that decision, and at those points it's important that we're able to respect the person's best interest, and we're going to talk about that in more detail as we go along. Best interest isn't just what you think here and now about, that would be best for them. There's actually a process that we would need to follow. And then finally, the 5th principle is about that we should seek the least restrictive option. And by that, if we do have to intervene and make some decision, it's really important that we take the least restrictive option in doing that. So this means that it isn't a matter of we've made the decision and then we just make a whole raft of decisions and the person actually has no choice whatsoever. But we need to be able to make sure that that person, the restriction might be in terms of the physical restriction of that person's movement or environment, but also that we are able to have them as fully involved as possible. So moving on to the next slide, which is about criminal offences under section 44. And this is just to say that alongside the other things it did in the Act, it introduced 2 new criminal offences around ill treatment and willful neglect of a person who lacks capacity to make relevant decisions. So this offence applied to people who were in care of, who are caring for a person who lacks capacity, and with a fine or imprisonment of up to 5 years. So that was quite key in terms of the vulnerability of people depending on others to make decisions for them. So just quickly, I'd like you to have a go at this exercise and think about decisions that you've recently made. So on slide 10, I'm saying to you, how did you reach the decision? So maybe it could be something, a major decision, a minor decision. What information did you need? Did you ask anybody for advice? Maybe you asked experts, friends who had similar experience. Maybe you wanted to ask somebody who you knew might have a very different perspective, because that would help you make an informed choice. And then think about, how do your choices, values and preferences shape your decision? So you could be thinking about it may be something around social justice, a political decision. It may be something around that your past experiences and your family and culture, anything could affect your decision. So we just want to have a minute to maybe think about that and write down some ideas. You can always pause the video whilst you do that. So moving on to slide number 11 around assessing capacity. Assessing capacity is, this must be about a particular decision that has to be made at a particular time. So you'll often hear in the Mental Capacity Act about it being decision specific and time specific, and that's really important to avoid those kind of assumptions about somebody's capacity. Oh, they don't make those decisions, they never make those decisions. Well, which decision? So if somebody was to come to me and say, oh, that they're unable to make them to make a decision about that, I would be very specific in saying which decision are we particularly talking about at this time. Often when we look at decisions, we may need to break them down. We may initially think that one decision is just one decision. We could break that down into potentially 10 different decisions that need to be made. And it may be that an individual can make some of those decisions, but not all of them. So that's really important. Then moving on to slide number 12, thinking about the triggers for assessment. So we're not saying that the Mental Capacity Act, that every morning that you wake up in supported living and you need to do a formal assessment of capacity of whether somebody wants cornflakes or Rice Krispies. This is about the principles of the Act do inform your work at every stage. So you are thinking about the Mental Capacity Act in terms of its principles when you're thinking about Rice Krispies or cornflakes. But there may be other situations where you're thinking for some other triggers of something maybe a little bit out of place here. We're not quite sure. It seems more serious. Maybe there's more risk attached to it. Maybe it has sort of longer lasting consequences. So the triggers for assessment, staff should always start with this presumption of capacity. So we're starting from that point. But then we might want to take into consideration the person's behaviour. We might want to think about they may be acting in a way which doesn't seem in line with other decisions that they've made, their circumstances. They may be in a very vulnerable relationship at that time. It may be that concerns have been raised from other people. Now, we're still not moving forward to say, oh, well, they're in a relationship that we don't agree with, so therefore we're going to prove that they can't make this decision. Remember, people can make unwise decisions, but these are just triggers to make us start thinking about some of those questions. So then section 2 of the Act talks about a two-stage capacity test, and this is on slide number 13. So this capacity test says, the first thing we say is, does the person have an impairment of or a disturbance in the functioning of their brain or mind? If the answer to that is yes, we also need to say, does this impairment or disturbance mean that the person is unable to make a specific decision when they need to? So it's really important that if we're looking at an assessment of capacity, we are asking those two questions. Without it, we cannot make any best interest decision for somebody. So if this is the case, we would then be looking at a person who is unable to make a particular decision. They're only unable by the law if they cannot do one or more of the following 4 things. So on the next slide, which is slide 15. Sorry, one moment. Slide 14. We could think of the 4 things are to understand, to communicate, to weigh up and retain. So in thinking about those 4 strands, for somebody to understand that we are going to have to, potentially somebody may not understand some complicated information, as we may not understand it if we have to make a very important decision. But it may be that we have to enhance that ability to understand. So there's real opportunities in this area in terms of assessing capacity to think about social pedagogy, think about creativity, think about enhancing communication with people. But how are we going to enhance that person to be able to understand? But they need to be able to demonstrate that they have some understanding of that decision. They also need to be able to communicate that decision to us. Now, they don't need to do that in fancy words or to have it in a written contract. Any type of communication that demonstrates that they have understood that decision is okay. They need to demonstrate that they can weigh up the decision. And by that we mean that taking that decision could lead to some consequences, but are they able to identify those consequences and almost rationalise, well, I've decided on the basis of this, I am going to do it. So it may be that somebody has decided that they want to buy something, they've got a particular amount of money in their account, it seems, maybe to us, it seems like a frivolous thing to buy, but they can say, no, I really want this because, and I know that that means I've got no money left in my account, and you know, I realise that I might not be able to go out much next month, but I still want that, and that would be fine. That's about weighing up. Now obviously that's about